I think we're good to go. All right. Let's see. All right, cool. Looks like we're all Gucci here. Um, so what's up? Um, Today we're just gonna be looking at this score for Theme of Love. Um, that VGO score just released. If you're not sure who VGO score is, basically, it's a YouTube channel that releases orchestral scores of a lot of video game music. Um, I think some are original arrangements, and a lot others are transcriptions of already existing orchestral covers. Um, so literally just today, he just uploaded this score for, well, whoops, for Theme of Love by Nobuo Uematsu for Final Fantasy IV. Um, and it's just like this arrangement. It's from the Distant Worlds album, which is a orchestral album of all Final Fantasy music. There's four of them actually. I saw Distant Worlds in concerts, and it was like one of the best concerts I've ever been to. Um, and this arrangement of the song is just absolutely gorgeous. So we're just gonna kind of take a look through it. Um, Basically, just sort of like um, listen to it a couple times, look through each section. I'm gonna start with the strings and I guess the harp and piano, since it's already in my view, just for simplicity's sake, and we're just gonna listen to it, probably all the way through, and talk about the orchestration of it. So let's start taking a listen. Is this it? Here we go. Did not mean to do that. Alright. I just didn't have the PDF viewer selected, so it just skipped ahead. So immediately it's kind of interesting to see the lack of strings happening. I've never really analyzed this before, so I don't know, it's just interesting. Still no violin ones. It's interesting to see the cellos and violas look like they're in unison there. The violas actually have a lot of interesting parts here. I feel like it's not often that you see violas moving so much. A lot of coming in on the offbeats. So both violas and cellos on the melody. I always thought it was only cellos. Of course, this being a transcription, I could be right about that, but I'll trust him. I think I can hear the violas now, actually. Oh, those triplets are so awesome. That cello line going down scale like that. Amazing. Wow. Okay, so let's go ahead and just talk about the strings for a second. Starting at the beginning here. Sorry, I have to keep like scrolling down to the string section. So yeah, actually what I think was very interesting is that, as far as the strings go, that they're not really holding the chords. You can tell that there's just a lot of rests and a lot of the string sections in this very opening here. And even like you can see the violas right there, kind of comes in on the offbeat, right? And that's kind of a thing I noticed throughout the entire piece, is that usually the tonality of the chord, especially mainly in the string section as far as I can see, isn't like established until the offbeat of one. So you can kind of see that being like hinted at right in the first measure there, that whatever, you know, that was horrible singing, by the way. But you can kind of see that just being hinted at there. It's very interesting. So let's see here, this next section here, right here, nothing really too interesting, just kind of generic background strings. I think it's kind of interesting that they're only using 3 notes at a time here. Maybe they're like kind of, whoops. Yeah, no, so it's only the strings and the piano. So I wasn't actually paying much attention to the harp and piano parts, but I think like in this first section, the piano is really kind of taking up a lot of the, like the chordy sort of parts, and that's just kind of where you get the tonality form from. Even though the strings definitely help out that, I think the piano really establishes a lot there, and it would really kind of die without the piano, to be honest. Alright, so let's move on to the next page here. What do we got? Yeah, pretty much just generic stuff. Not having any double bass, just having the cellos kind of taking the bass. Just for a while, until this little line here in measure 12, which is kind of interesting because like you just kind of, the violas and violins are kind of, violin twos are just kind of keeping the same sort of like rhythms for the most part. Like every once in a while something a little bit different, but you can see that the viola just drops out for a whole hot beat right there, and then just comes in with this little melodic flowing line right there, and it's just very beautiful. So I think that's a really interesting thing to do, especially in this sort of instance where, you know, your strings are mainly the background instrument and we don't really have any other instruments going on besides the oboe, which has the melody here. And you always want forward motion in your orchestrations and such. So I can see that why the actual viola line is there. So you can see that the melody in the oboe is ending right there, just holding out a note, which means that for all these 3 beats in this measure, there's nothing happening melody-wise, except maybe the piano is just kind of doing its thing. But by now, the piano has become just so ingrained within your brain that you kind of just zone it out. So to keep that forward motion there, the viola kind of drops out for a hot sec, then comes back in to grab your attention and to keep you moving throughout the song. So let's see. I'm pretty sure this is a pizzicato. I don't see it marked. Maybe it's in the beginning. But we can see here, double bass comes in. Pretty much the same sort of thing. Pretty normal string writing you got here. Just making sure that there's no real points where it's like nothing happening. You can see the harp also enters here. I think a harp is a really good way to sort of just start getting like just some more like tonality in your chords. I'm using that word a lot, but I mean, hey, whatever. I'm stupid. But the harp, I mean, being a string instrument obviously goes really, really well with other string instruments. And when this harp comes in, it starts playing chords along with the strings below the flute and oboe, I think now. Yep. Makes for some really beautiful stuff. All right, and then here's where we start getting into more instruments. Oh, okay, so this is interesting. I've actually been really interested in seeing how percussion is notated in different scores. And I see that this is a pretty interesting way to kind of go about it, and yeah, I like this way. Okay. That's pretty much nothing. But yeah, still pretty generic string writing here. And here's what's interesting is that when the first violins finally actually come in right here in measure 19, they're actually adding to the melody. You can see that they're doubling the melody along with the flutes and oboes. And ooh, what the hell, I did not want to do that. Along with the flutes and oboes. Which really adds emphasis to the end of that melody, which I think is that's a really clever way of doing it. If you really want to add emphasis to a certain line, which is something that you should be doing in your orchestrations, just adding another instrument to double up on that line, on that melody, is definitely a good way to do it. I think there's some more points like that in this song later on where we'll have like maybe, I don't really remember exactly, but I feel like there's a part where the cello plays a melody, and then to highlight a certain aspect of that melody, a bassoon also comes in and plays it along with it, just to add some richness to the orchestration. All right, so here, measure 21 pickups to 22. We can see that it's actually starting to... This is where the violins actually start taking over the melody. And of course, it's not by itself. It is along with all these woodwind instruments. I think woodwinds and strings, just doubling them up together, I see it a lot. It's just really beautiful. And like, just doubling any of these woodwinds, really, there's so many like really beautiful combinations you can do with the woodwinds. So when the clarinets finally come in, I think for the first time maybe in the entire song, or maybe they were in the beginning, I can't really remember. They're also adding emphasis to that melody. So we can see that this is a forte part of the melody. This is probably the biggest part of the melody, this B section of the melody here. So to have all these high, very prominent instruments playing it is a really good way to make that stand out. Of course, you have brass that is more prominent, that is not playing this melody, I believe. Yeah, all we have is brass playing chords right now. Later on, I know trumpet comes in and also plays this exact same B section melody, but it's a lot louder, it's a lot more grand. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious, but, you know, if you want something to sound grand, use trumpet. And here's what I was talking about earlier. You can see it really starting here in the string section, that the strings don't come in until the offbeat. And I think that, like, it's just a cool way to really sort of, like, keep the melody always moving forward, even when the melody isn't actually moving forward. Or, I mean, that doesn't make sense, but keep the piece moving forward when the melody isn't moving forward. So looking at this now, you can see that the melody goes up and it stays on this dotted quarter note. So while this melody is on the dotted quarter note, then other instruments come in and are moving while the melody is staying still. So even though your ear's going to that melody, you still feel that forward movement of the song, from these strings that are going up like these arpeggios, while the melody is staying still. And I think that that is pretty consistent throughout the melody, because the melody follows a pretty similar rhythmic pattern throughout. So it makes sense for the accompaniment to follow that same sort of pattern to keep it driving forward. And you'll notice that there's pretty much no percussion in this section besides a sustained cymbal. So really, I think this is something I kind of think about when I'm doing orchestrations. Is that percussion is like icing on the cake as far as like rhythmic percussion goes. Like if your song doesn't feel driving without percussion, then it's kind of a cop out. It's kind of lazy. Like unless maybe like I don't know, like a marching band piece or something, but I don't even really think like I mean if your marching band piece sounds rhythmic without percussion, then that's a damn good marching band piece. But like just keeping this sort of like constantly driving forward motion in the music without percussion is awesome. So like whenever you're doing your orchestrations, just make sure you're always kind of like having some sort of driving force in the music. And this applies not even just to orchestrations, but to just like any kind of music. Okay, so these measures in 28 and 29 are kind of interesting, because it's just 2 bars where the melody is over. The melody is just holding out a note, and it's the last note of this B section melody, which gives you a lot more freedom to put in some kind of cool little stuff here. So we have a lot of accidentals in this section of the melody, and the viola is kind of passing it back and forth between the violas and the cello. Really cool stuff. Let me see, is this little cello line doubled with anything? No, not really. But you can see that the strings kind of just take it over here. Everything else is just playing chords, standing still. But to make sure that that forward motion is still there, the strings are driving forward, and it's really cool. Even with strings, they have such a similar tone to them, right, to each of the strings. But it's just different enough that if you pass it back and forth between strings, it sounds really cool. So when we see here in measure 28, when that viola melody is flowing and then it just passes it off to the cello and it just passes it back to the viola, like that's really cool. You can hear that, and even between violin 1 and violin 2, like if you're listening, you can hear when it passes off the melody and it just sounds awesome, which we can see happening in this very next section. These eighth notes just kind of being passed back and forth between the string sections, and just building on top of each other. It's a really cool like way to add some accompaniment. So you know, like you don't your melody line, whatever instrument is playing the melody doesn't have to be the only one moving. So you see a lot in like beginner orchestrations where it's just like chords and then some instrument playing a melody. But if you can have some sort of counter melodies going on below that, not necessarily, I wouldn't say like Bach levels, because Bach is fucking insane. But like some counter melodies going on below that in the strings is just absolutely beautiful. Personally, I almost never put my melodies in strings, unless it's also doubling up with another instrument or it's like some weird grand part. I almost always have the melody in some sort of other instrument, and then the strings just doing shit like this, just doing cool stuff. Like string writing is cool. Just having stuff constantly moving in string writing, it's awesome. All right, let's see. You know, same thing here. And this is also a really another cool stuff. If you want to put some new, different sort of rhythms to catch the ear, it's good. And I think when you're doing that in string writing, you can see it's done pretty well here. Just kind of keep it limited to one string. Like give like one string section like this little kind of solo sort of thing, even if like, you know, you're not going to pick it out in the very first listen. Like this little viola line here with the triplet, like that's a lot different from what we usually have heard. And this is around the end of the melody too. So, you know, it goes back to that sort of like topic of like highlighting different parts of your melodies. Usually you want to kind of highlight the end of the melody. It's just kind of a cool like way to add cadences, right? Like add highlights to your cadences, which is kind of what's being done here with this rhythm, this new rhythm, these triplets that weren't in the string section at all prior in this section, starting at this bar line here. Just to add highlights to that end of the melody, just to really bring some extra like oomph to your cadence. So yeah, kind of same stuff here. Really cool like way to transition between chords, just especially if you're doing like circle of fifth stuff, just having a scale down to the next chord. I mean, it's nothing really special. I can't be like, this is amazing. But you know, it's a pretty common thing to do. And it's common because it sounds good. And this kind of section here, same sort of stuff, where you have the violin playing a pretty simple melody. You know, there's a lot like open space here between this dotted quarter note and this quarter note. So, you know, just in that open space, make sure you have stuff going on in your string sections. Blah, blah, blah. Like, keep strings moving is all I can really say. It just, if you keep your strings moving, it sounds fantastic. All right, so these are like runs here. The septuplet runs. I mean, as long as they're in your chord, just do a scale. Like, really, whoever's listening, especially if it's a whole section, is not going to be able to pick out shit with this. So really, don't worry too much about the runs. Just make sure that whatever notes you're using in the run is within the chord that the rest of the instruments are playing. All right, so this is a pretty giant section. I think this is where the trumpet also comes and play the melody. No, it's not. Okay, well, whatever, that's fine. Actually, interesting. This is kind of a section where it's mainly strings. But yeah, so after that, kind of build up. Like, runs are a really good way for build ups. Especially like going into key changes, like put a run at the beginning of that, or at the beginning of that key change, to pick up the key change. It's just a really cool way to make your thing grand. But you probably already knew that. Okay, so once again, we have pretty similar patterns going on with the strings here as we did before. Coming in on the offbeats, just driving forward whenever the melody is holding out notes, so nothing really new here. Handy section with triplets, kind of just like an interesting little melody to throw in there. Especially if you're doing a song like this where you're sort of just going between A-B melody, A-B, A-B, A-B. Just like every once in a while, sort of throw in some stuff to change up that melody a little bit, just so it doesn't get boring. Once again, viola is doing a little thing here to keep it interesting. All right, so here's a key change right here. So violas and cellos playing the melody here. Now, basically, this is almost the exact same thing as what was going on before, except the violins had the melodies and the lower instruments were playing the accompaniment. But it's the same thing. We're starting on the offbeats, just keeping it driving forward whenever the melody is holding out notes, right? Pretty much the same exact shit, just the melody's in a lower register now. The thing you have to be careful about with melodies in lower registers is, let me see the other stuff here, is you need to make sure that the other instruments are not playing in that same register. So if you have a melody going on a low register, and then you have French horns, and you can see this is a pretty wide ranging melody of like a pretty big range of notes. But let's say you had horns playing chords, which is a pretty common thing to do, just have horns play like the third and five of the chord, right? Like that's like prime zone in like violin, cello territory whenever they have the melody. So if you have these chords that are playing like around pretty much the same notes as this, it's going to sound mushy. Your melody in the lower register isn't going to come out. So you just need to make sure that everything going on around the melody, if your melody is somewhere in the middle of the orchestra, not on the top, is not interfering with this at all. So if you were to open this up in a piano roll, you wouldn't see pretty much any notes in this register except for the ones actually playing the melody. So that's just something to keep in mind whenever you're doing low register melodies. Wow, this is actually taking a long time. Probably won't do every instrument like I originally planned, but we'll do the strings. Okay, so this next string section, A lot of cool stuff going on. Pretty much you're just like doing some build ups and all that shit, right? Um, so having these triplets in here, it's just kind of interesting stuff, right? I wouldn't say there's anything too special about them other than they're just kind of like adding a bit more movement than usual. Since this is like sort of like a weird part of the song, right? Um, Having this sort of like triplets, they're moving a little bit faster than the eighth notes that you're used to. Just adds a little bit more tension, a little bit more driving force to the song. And pretty much that's all it does. And, once again, really happening a lot whenever the melody is just holding out notes. Nothing really going on in the melody, as you can see. Still here in the viola and cello section. Let's see, is this where we have the, yeah, okay, so now this is where the melody actually comes in with the trumpets. This giant fucking crescendo, which you can see is just, like I said, using runs, just use those runs if you're going to do giant crescendos into a big grand thing. And what's interesting about, like, grand parts, right, like really grand sounding music, is that this is one of the few times where I don't usually have like constantly driving forward strings, right? And you can see it here too, where the strings are playing the melody along with the trumpets up there. You can't see it, but the trumpets are also playing the melody, and then the cellos and bass are literally just playing the root of the chord. And what else do we have? Just chords, and melody. So literally this part, this grand part, is literally just melody and chords. And that's kind of how I usually like to stick to it. I think I have like a song I could show of mine that I do something like that, but I won't right now. Just kind of, if you want a really grand part, first of all, give your melody to the trumpets. They love it. And just kind of keep chords behind it. I think it just brings out the melody as most important at this part. We're coming pretty close to the end of the song here now. And for the most part, nothing special. Kind of stuff I already talked about. Kind of, moving back and forth. You can see that this is the sort of the same exact line as before when I talked about the violas, switching it off to the cello, switching back to the violas. Like the same exact kind of stuff. If you do repetition, such as this, whenever you're like how he had the violas and violoncellos and violoncellos, cellos and then viola switch back, just like he did right in the beginning of the song. It's good to have repetition in your music. Let's see here, pretty much the same stuff. And here we're on the last part of the song. And yeah, you can see that he really wanted to chill out a lot here. So, I mean, if you want to chill out, you don't want it driving, then, don't have it driven. I think it's a good idea to pretty much always be driving unless you specifically don't want that. And this is a part where it makes a lot of sense to not be driven a lot because it's very soft. It's the end of the song. This constant pretty much decrescendo here into the end. I think what's interesting is that you pretty much have a piccolo or a flute. Wow, okay, so not a piccolo. Playing the melody here, and that's it. And for a while, it's just the flute and nothing else holding out this note. It's just like, it adds tension whenever you like, all instruments drop out except for one. Like, that adds a little bit of tension here. And we can see that this is not your typical cadence right here, which is just, I don't know, I think using weird cadences like this is kind of cool. I'm not going to actually pick out this chord. I'd have to bring it up on the piano to really analyze it and see how it resolves to the tonic. But it's an interesting cadence nonetheless. So yeah, kind of just went through the entire string section. I'm not going to do that for every single section of the song, at least not in this one stream, because, I hadn't even really planned on doing this stream. But, hey, I figured since I saw it there, I was like, oh shit, might as well do it, because it's out, the VGO score released it. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. So yeah, make sure you check out VGO Scores channel. He has a lot of cool orchestral scores on the for video games on his channel. So make sure you check that out. You can download them all for free. They come with parts as well. So I guess if you wanted to like perform them, then I guess you could. Not really sure how the copyrights go for that, but it's a thing. So yeah, thanks for watching the stream, and yeah, see you guys later.